I was at a bistro in D.C. recently, and I was sitting near this woman. She was clearly a high-level policy consultant.
Oh, you can always tell.
You can. She was one of those people who speaks in deliverables and optimization.
Right.
And she was leaning over her kale salad, just, practically glowing with this confidence of someone who manages systems for a living. And she was celebrating the OBBBA Act like it was this personal victory.
A victory. Wow.
She kept using these phrases, pruning the fiscal overhang and realigning incentives. Her eyes were bright with this really clinical, almost giddy excitement.
So to her, the policy wasn't about people. It was just a number on a spreadsheet.
Exactly. It was a beautiful, clean line on a spreadsheet, finally moving in the right direction. And then she actually gestured toward our server, this man in his early 60s, tired eyes, a bit of a hitch in his gait, and she whispers to her friend that this is exactly what the 55 to 64 cohort needs.
Unbelievable.
She truly believed that cutting SNAP benefits was a form of tough love, that it would restore the dignity of work to 1 million aging Americans. She spoke with this detached authority of the managerial class, convinced she was helping the social remainder by stripping away their lifeline.
The social remainder. That's a chilling phrase.
It is. But then the conversation took a sharp turn. Her friend mentioned a rumor that the federal government might scale back the tax credits for the very social impact NGOs her firm consulted for.
And here it comes.
In an instant, the mask of fiscal discipline just vanished, her face flushed with genuine anger. She started railing against the short-sightedness of the government. She even used the word betrayal.
Betrayal. So austerity is for other people, but when it affects her own bottom line, it's a betrayal.
She went from championing austerity for the poor to demanding protection for her own bureaucratic niche without skipping a single beat. That shift, cheering on the hunger of 1 million people one minute, then indignantly defending her own subsidies the next, it was staggering.
And that anecdote, it's far more revealing than any budget document could ever be, because it just captures the central contradiction of the policies we're going to be analyzing today.
How so?
The support for austerity among that managerial class, it's rarely, if ever, based on pure objective economic necessity. Instead, as the analysis suggests, it's rooted in a self-serving class belief.
A belief that their assets, their institutions, they have to be protected.
Exactly. Their cultural capital is inherently valuable and it must be protected and expanded. And conversely, the costs of maintaining the system, or, the costs of its decline, they have to be aggressively offloaded onto those they categorize as non-productive.
Or in her words, the social remainder.
Right.
It really is an inversion of that fundamental principle of shared sacrifice. When the system creates winners through monetary policy and asset inflation, those winners claim the wealth is because of their personal merit, their hard work.
But when that same system generates massive systemic losses through inflation, debt, the need for austerity, the winners immediately pivot and claim the losers just lack discipline or they need tough love.
It creates a moral justification for what is fundamentally a wealth transfer.
Which is exactly why our mission today is to unpack these intricate and frankly devastating mechanisms, the economic, the sociological, the ideological, that are driving what's being described as a systemic default.
And we have a few key pillars to examine.
We do. We're going to start with the Cantillon effect, which really provides the economic foundation for this whole erosion of wealth. Then we're going to dive into the specific policy sledgehammer, the OBBBA Act, and its immediate impact on the aging population.
And from there, we connect that policy to the breakdown of social cohesion through the sociological concept of anomie.
Right. And finally, we're going to uncover how this ideological veil, these luxury beliefs, provide the necessary moral justification for this whole profound societal shift.
So let's begin where the damage started. The engine of economic inequality. Okay, so let's unpack this. And we have to start with this foundational concept of non-neutral money. Historically, economists often assume that when the money supply expands, it affects everyone equally, right? A uniform rise in prices.
The old, "a rising tide lifts all boats" idea.
Exactly. But Richard Cantillon's 18th century insight just completely dismantled that idea. He showed that money is anything but neutral. So what is the core mechanism of the Cantillon effect that explains how the expansion of money inherently functions as a wealth transfer?
Well, the mechanism is really all about sequence and point of entry. So when a central authority expands the money supply, the first recipients, those closest to the source, which today is the financial sector, they get that new purchasing power before prices have adjusted upward.
So they get to spend the new money at the old lower prices.
Precis. They can accumulate real resources, real assets. Then, as that new money flows outward, propagating through the economy step by step, it dilutes the value of the currency held by everyone else downstream.
So by the time that liquidity reaches people on fixed incomes or the working poor whose wages lag behind,
it's too late. By then, the currency's purchasing power has already been substantially diminished. The result is this non-uniform, localized inflation, which systematically transfers wealth from the periphery of the economy to the center.
And this is where it gets really interesting in the modern context, especially concerning the policy responses from, say, 2020 through 2025. The analysis argues that the scale and method of quantitative easing QE and all that monetary expansion, it wasn't just a broad economic stimulus, it functioned more like a targeted strike.
Absolutely. It was incredibly targeted. When central banks engage in QE, they're not just dropping money from helicopters. They are buying assets, treasuries, mortgage-backed securities, primarily from large financial institutions and banks.
So the money goes straight into Wall Street.
It instantly shows up on the balance sheets of asset holders, and that drives up the prices of stocks, of investment properties, of complex financial instruments. This action disproportionately enriched the managerial class, the investor class, and large corporations.
While the working class, who hold very few or no appreciable assets,
they experienced all the pain of price inflation in their daily lives with none of the benefit of asset inflation.
So in effect, the central bank's actions solidified the wealth gap by inflating the assets of the rich first, while the slow, corrosive effect of that inflation only later reached the working population as higher prices for, gas and groceries.
They got the currency devaluation without the asset appreciation. It is, to be blunt, the systemic theft of real wealth through policy. Yeah. And we see this so acutely in the experience of the aging working class who really relied on a fixed expectation of economic stability.
We can really illustrate this with the experience of a man named Elias, a 59-year-old former machinist in Ohio. He kind of represents the classic silent casualty of this monetary erosion.
He's the guy who did everything right, according to the old rules.
Exactly. He spent 3 decades believing in the specific social contract of the industrial era, that if you played by the rules, you worked hard, you contributed to the machine would look after you in your later years. But as the system has defaulted, that contract has been broken.
And not by some overt legislative act, but by this silent monetary tide.
Right. So imagine Elias going to the supermarket. While the printed money flowed upward, inflating the assets of corporate headquarters and investment firms, it only trickled down to him in the form of what he experiences as real inflation.
So his fixed sense of security is just being eroded by something he can't even see or fight. It's just currency devaluation.
And that's now compounded by the fact that the OBBBA Act is stripping away his basic lifelines, like SNAPI benefits. The social contract he signed with his own sweat equity has been unilaterally voided by the state.
And what makes his situation so cruel is how the official metrics, the official numbers, actively obscure this decline. The source material points out that the official Consumer Price Index, the CPI, uses these specific statistical techniques.
Right, hedonic adjustments and substitution biases.
That systematically disguise the true inflation hitting essential goods.
This is such a critical point. I think we need to illuminate it. Let's break down those 2 biases. What's substitution bias?
So substitution bias occurs when the index assumes, mathematically, that consumers will switch from expensive goods to cheaper ones. For instance, if the price of beef rises dramatically, the CPI model assumes that you'll just substitute chicken or beans for beef.
So the perceived inflation rate is lower than the actual price increase of the beef.
Exactly. But it doesn't account for the fact that for essential items, things like protein, quality, or dietary needs, might prevent that substitution. It's a neat trick on paper, but it doesn't reflect reality.
And then there's hedonic adjustments. That's where it gets even more complicated and you could argue more misleading for the average person.
It really is. Hedonic adjustment assumes that if the quality of a product improves, part of the price increase is because of that quality improvement, not pure inflation. A common example is computers or smartphones.
Okay, so a new phone is more powerful than last year's model.
Right. It's more powerful every year. So if the price stays the same or rises only slightly, the index actually calculates that the effective price has dropped because you're getting more computing power per dollar.
That might be statistically true for tech, but it fundamentally obscures the inflation that's just ravaging essential, non-negotiable goods.
Things like food, energy, and shelter. The exact goods that people like Elias spend the vast majority of their diminished income on.
So when official statistics tell you that inflation is moderate, but the cost of your housing and your groceries has truly skyrocketed, it's not you. The purchasing power of your fixed income and benefits was silently eviscerated long before any legislative cuts took place.
That's the key. The sources argue the state had already taxed their real wealth through inflation. The OBBBA Act is merely the second explicit legislative strike.
This creates what's called the inverted incentive structure. The elites benefit from asset inflation, the soaring value of their stocks and properties.
Right.
And at the same time, the state determines that the cost of maintaining the social contract, basic nutritional assistance, healthcare, it has to be aggressively reduced and offloaded onto society's most vulnerable.
So aging manual laborers whose bodies are worn out from a previous industrial system are now forced to pay the cost of the system's monetary policy twice over.
Let's broaden this out a little bit to the connection between inflation, debt, and wealth redistribution. There's a general economic rule that says unexpected inflation benefits borrowers because it devalues the currency they have to pay back and it harms lenders. But in practice, this classical principle doesn't apply cleanly to the poor, does it?
No, it really doesn't. You have to look at the types of debt held by different classes. People who hold no appreciating assets and just rely on fixed incomes are harmed most by inflation, full stop. But let's look closer at the debt. Wealthy borrowers, they typically hold fixed-rate mortgages or large corporate loans. Inflation does help devalue those.
But the working poor, the cohort Elias belongs to, they often hold variable interest rate debts.
Exactly. We're talking about high-interest credit cards, variable lines of credit, auto loans. So when the central bank raises interest rates to combat the very inflation it created, these variable rates shoot up,
increasing the monthly payments for the working poor dramatically.
So not only did inflation eat their savings, but the anti-inflation policy response actually made their debt servicing more expensive. They get the absolute worst of both worlds.
The sources are pretty strong in their critique of the Federal Reserve's singular focus on reflating the money supply exclusively into the financial system, flowing almost entirely to Wall Street and the too-big-to-fail banks. Why is this focus so misplaced, given the current economic structure?
Well, the critique hinges on where the economic need truly lies. The vast majority of non-government debt today is held by households and non-financial corporations. They are the engines of consumption and productive capacity.
They're the ones who need debt relief to reignite any real economic activity.
Desperately. The financial sector, which has been the primary recipient of all this new money-hoarding vast quantities of excess reserves, is the least needful of stimulus. This focus is framed in the analysis as prioritizing the solvency of the financial elite over the stability of the average household.
This leads directly to a fascinating and, I have to say, very radical proposal that's discussed in some of the sources, the idea of a modern debt jubilee.
It sounds like a fringe theory, but it's an attempt to solve this structural debt crisis without resorting to the kind of painful austerity that only harms the poor. The premise is simple. Debt that cannot be repaid will not be repaid.
So rather than suffer 2 lost decades of stagnation under a mountain of private debt, a targeted intervention is needed.
Exactly. And since the securitization of debt makes the ancient concept of just canceling it pretty impractical, the modern version is proposed as quantitative easing for the public.
That's a concept worth spending some time on. How would QE for the public actually operate? And how would it avoid just triggering hyperinflation?
So instead of new money flowing exclusively into bank reserves to inflate assets, it would be channeled directly into the bank accounts of individuals. But, and this is the key constraint that addresses the inflation concern, this money must be functionally ring-fenced or earmarked for the sole purpose of paying down existing consumer debt.
Things like credit cards, medical bills, student loans.
Yes. The goal isn't to increase spending, but to zero out liabilities.
A one-time wealth injection designed to deleverage the household sector, not to fuel consumer demand.
Precisely. It achieves genuine debt reduction for those who need it most. And critically, it reduces the profitability of the financial sector, which profits from that high-interest debt without impacting the core solvency of the banking system.
So the sources are basically emphasizing that without a radical, targeted approach to household debt, economic growth is just going to remain stagnant.
It will, because every available dollar is trapped servicing increasingly punitive, high-interest liabilities.
So if the Cantillon effect has silently eroded the economic foundation of the aging working class through non-neutral money and inflation,
then the next section shows the moment the state moves from that passive economic betrayal to active legislative default. The economic theft becomes explicit policy.
let's pivot to the OBBBA Act itself and the immediate financial crisis it imposes on retirees. This is where the budget language starts to feel like a carefully constructed trap. We're looking at 30 million beneficiaries affected in 2026. At first glance, the news seems, marginally positive. A projected Social Security COLA increase of around 2.8%.
That 2.8% is the bait. The switch is the simultaneous mandatory expense surge. The Medicare Part B premium, which is deducted directly from Social Security benefits for most retirees, is projected to spike by a massive 9.7%.
Moving from what, about $185 a month to over $200?
To $202.90 per month.
So for dual enrollees people receiving both Social Security and Medicare, that premium hike just almost entirely eliminates the benefit increase. Can you walk us through the actual net financial consequence of that?
Certainly. For the average retiree, that COLA might result in, say, a $50 or $60 increase in their total benefit. But when nearly $18 of that is immediately consumed by the Part B premium increase, the net benefit increase is whittled down to about $38 a month.
Which is negligible.
It's nothing. It certainly does not cover the real inflation we just talked about in food, energy, and housing, which is far higher than the official CPI figures used to calculate the COLA in the first place. This is a systemic default. It uses the mechanism of the safety net itself to redistribute wealth away from the vulnerable.
And this squeeze is compounded by the centerpiece of the OBBBA Act, the $186 billion cut from SNAPI benefits.
That $186 billion is, as the sources define it, a systemic default against atomized individuals. SNAP is fundamental nutritional security. To target this massive cut at a time when the purchasing power of the dollar is already so diminished is not just belt-tightening. It's aggressively undermining the physical stability of an already precarious demographic.
But the act is far more insidious than just cutting core benefits. It also layers on these policy barriers and penalties that make accessing any assistance program harder. It feels like a deliberate attempt to exclude and punish. Could you detail some of the specific eligibility restrictions in the OBBBA?
The restrictions really demonstrate a deliberate policy choice to exclude and erode coverage for the most marginal populations. So the Act specifically excludes certain immigrant populations, refugees, asylees, and people with temporary protected status from Medicare enrollment.
So people who have often worked in the country but lack the full security of citizens.
Exactly. Additionally, the Act actively blocks improvements to crucial Medicare savings programs for nearly a decade.
And the broader healthcare consequences, they extend beyond just Medicare, right?
They do. The accompanying Medicaid cuts and the substantial reductions to ACA marketplace subsidies are projected to be catastrophic for the lower income brackets. The analysis estimates that these reductions will cause 10 million Americans to lose their health coverage by 2034.
And when that happens, it doesn't just hurt the uninsured.
No, it creates these cascading costs across the entire healthcare system. You get more acute, untreated illnesses pushed into already overburdened emergency rooms, which indirectly raises costs for everyone, including Medicare beneficiaries.
Now, let's talk about the policy advice that comes from the managerial class. Go back to work. For those who try to follow this advice and re-enter the labor market, they run straight into the brick wall of the Social Security earnings test. This is where the implicit tax rate becomes just shocking.
The penalties are so punitive that they actively disincentivize labor participation among older workers who need supplemental income. If you're below your full retirement age in 2026, the earnings limit is set at $24,480.
And what happens the moment you earn that extra dollar? $24,481.
For every $2 earned above that threshold, $1 is withheld from your Social Security benefit.
That's an effective 50% implicit tax rate on those marginal earnings.
Yes. And that rate often stacks on top of state and federal income taxes, meaning a low-income senior trying to make ends meet can face a marginal tax rate approaching 70 or even 80%. The system is punishing the very work it supposedly champions.
And even for those nearing full retirement age, where the penalty is slightly less severe, the discouragement is still there.
It is. The threshold rises to $65,160, but they still lose $1 for every $3 earned beyond that limit. These rules create a perverse incentive structure. The state demands work, but simultaneously makes that work financially irrational.
It's like a maze.
It is. The complexity ensures that those needing assistance spend immense energy just navigating regulations, only to be heavily penalized if they successfully earn enough to slightly improve their situation.
This brings us to the demographic group targeted by the core policies of the OBBBA Act. This 55 to 64 cohort, which is starkly characterized in the sources as the social remainder. That designation is so loaded, it suggests they're structural casualties, not just temporarily unemployed.
It's a clinical designation. This cohort is characterized as the residual product of massive civilizational transitions, the fallout of deep deindustrialization in the 80s and 90s, and the disintegration of the traditional nuclear family structure.
And critically, this group lacks buffering communal support networks.
They're often socially atomized, they lack the institutional safety of strong unions or pensions, and they lack the communal safety of extended family or tight-knit communities. When a person lacks the scaffolding of family, community, and institutional protection, they are uniquely vulnerable to systemic shocks.
And the policy response to this vulnerable atomized cohort is the 20-hour work requirement, a mandate the sources call a mandated paradox.
It's a cruel mandate because it forces individuals, often with degraded health from decades of physically demanding labor, into a labor market that structurally rejects them. The modern service and gig economy demands youth, digital fluency, physical agility, and relentless adaptability.
It has no use for chronic back pain or outdated skill sets or the physical exhaustion that comes from a lifetime of manual labor.
None at all.
So the functional outcome of the work requirement isn't genuine reintegration into a meaningful job market.
No, not at all. The resulting consequence, as described in the sources, is invisible exile. The system demands compliance, the performance of searching for work or taking precarious gig jobs, but the outcome is often meaningless labor or just constant exhausting churn. They're forced into a mechanism that structurally rejects them.
Which leads to social alienation, not self-sufficiency.
And that involuntary transition into precarity lays the groundwork for a profound collapse of institutional trust, which leads us directly into the sociological analysis.
So to connect the policy failure of the OBBBA Act to the deep individual distress it causes, we really have to do a deep dive into the concept of anomie.
Yes, we do.
We often hear anomie loosely defined as just normlessness, but its etymology, the ancient Greek anomia, which means lawlessness or without law, and its use by Emil Durkheim suggests something far more visceral than just a lack of rules. What was Durkheim's core understanding of anomie?
Durkheim described anomie not merely as the absence of norms, but as a state of derangement. Or, even more powerfully, an insatiable will, what he called the malady of the infinite.
The malady of the infinite.
Yes. This condition arises when society fails to regulate the expectations and desires of its members. When the restraints on desire disappear, the individual is condemned to this cycle of perpetual striving and disappointment because a desire without limit can never be fulfilled. It only becomes more intense.
So it's not chaos, it's a moral deregulation where your personal standards are completely mismatched with the wider social standards, where the foundational social ethic is just dissolved. It's the exhaustion of ceaseless, meaningless ambition imposed upon a fragile individual.
Exactly. Durkheim primarily linked it to rapid societal change when the old collective identity gives way and the new one hasn't solidified. The ties that bind the individual to others become slackened or broken, leading to profound alienation and a weakening of the social fabric.
And then Robert K. Merton extended this framework in 1938, linking anomie directly to social deviance, which makes it immediately relevant to these OBBBA mandates.
Yes, Merton argued that deviance and the resulting sense of social failure arises from the discontinuity between shared social goals and the legitimate, institutionalized means available to achieve them.
Okay, so if society, through media and policy, sets up goals like financial security and basic sustenance,
but it structurally limits the legitimate paths for the aging cohort to achieve them, individuals are forced into what Merton called retreatism or rebellion, or the desperate, structurally constrained innovation of the gig economy.
This application feels incredibly relevant to the reality imposed by the OBBBA work requirements.
Yeah.
I saw this testimonial about a 63-year-old named Arthur, and it just perfectly encapsulates this state-induced anomie.
What was his story?
Arthur has chronic back pain from prior manual labor. He's now forced to demonstrate work participation just to keep his basic grocery allowance.
And how is this work participation being measured? Not through meaningful employment, I assume.
No, it's often through these precarious gig work apps that monetize every minute of his effort. He's forced to compete with younger, digitally fluent workers performing these small tasks, driving, delivery, micro gigs, just to earn enough points for a grocery voucher.
The indignity is immense.
It is. He's not just losing his food security, he's losing his established, recognizable place in society. He's being pushed into a labor mechanism that fundamentally does not want him, leading to a total collapse of institutional trust. The work is performance, not production.
Arthur's situation represents state-induced anomie in its purest, most modern form. The functionalist view holds that when an individual is stripped of all social scaffolding, familial support, community ties, and now state-sanctioned sustenance, they are violently cast into Durkheim's deranged state.
They're told to participate in a meritocracy that has already decided they are excess.
And the resulting feeling is profound alienation, despair, and a recognition that the game is fixed.
So what does this aggressive default mean for the social contract itself?
The Act, in targeting its most vulnerable citizens, represents the death of the social contract's foundational premise. That mutual agreement that the state guarantees a basic floor of dignity and sustenance in exchange for social peace, legitimacy, and adherence to social norms.
And the sources suggest that drawing the knife against the weakest just annihilates any residual institutional trust.
It does. Once the state demonstrates it will not prevent its citizens from starving, the moral and legal incentive to maintain allegiance to that state's norms or legal structures it disappears. The trust is replaced by what the analysis terms jungle law or the entropy of civilization. People recognize they are on their own.
So when the state retreats and the social contract collapses, that void has to be filled by something. This leads directly to the predictable societal consequence of the parallel polis.
This is a form of social self-defense. It's a predictable reaction to institutional failure. People do not simply starve quietly. They begin to create robust parallel structures for mutual survival, built specifically outside the decaying official edifice.
So we should anticipate the strengthening and rise of localized non-state structures.
Absolutely. Things like black market barter networks for essential goods, illegal homesteading, and community-based mutual aid groups dedicated to survival.
And these structures arise precisely because the prevailing order has proven not only incapable of protecting them, but actively hostile. They are organizing against the system that declared them disposable.
The focus shifts entirely from institutional compliance to basic material survival. This provides a temporary, desperate return to a form of localized social solidarity, but it's one born of necessity and deep distrust.
The question remains then, why is this being championed by those who manage the system? The answer isn't just economic necessity, which is the justification that's often cited. It's the deep ideological insulation provided by what are called luxury beliefs.
The justification is always the final piece of the puzzle. It provides the necessary moral veil for cruelty.
So let's define luxury beliefs clearly. This is a concept that seems to perfectly describe the intellectual landscape of the contemporary managerial class.
A luxury belief is an intellectual or cultural idea adopted by the elite primarily to signal high social status or cultural capital. Crucially, they are defined by the believer's distance from necessity and their comfortable insulation from the practical risks or negative consequences that the belief imposes on others.
It signals that the person is so secure, geographically and financially, that they can afford the ideological indulgence.
Exactly.
And this concept ties directly back to the sociologist Paul Fussell's work on class markers, where he identified physical danger as a reliable marker of low social class.
Yes, Fussell noted that occupations involving physical risk, a diesel mechanic, a long-haul truck driver, a power line installer, are considered working class, often regardless of pay, because the job is fundamentally dangerous.
Whereas a policy consultant, an academic, or a white-collar manager occupies a middle or upper-middle-class station because the job is physically safe?
Precisely. The person holding a luxury belief can advocate for policies that increase financial precarity or even physical danger for others, like cutting SNAPI benefits and forcing the sick into manual gig work, because they are personally insulated from suffering those consequences.
And the hypocrisy becomes crystal clear when we compare the $186 billion SNAPI cut with the simultaneous expansion of the bureaucracy that implements these policies.
We can use the anecdote of Clara, a 61-year-old from a deindustrialized town in Pennsylvania, to illustrate this contrast. While her food assistance was slashed by the OBBBA Act, she observed her local community center, which was once a source of tangible material support, being converted into a hub for administrative outreach and sensitivity training.
So services that are funded by the very budgets the OBBBA Act spared, or perhaps even expanded.
This contrast is damning. The managerial class is thriving, expanding the federal administrative apparatus, the sprawling NGO industrial complex, and the legion of DEI consultancies. They are prioritizing their own bureaucratic survival and growth over the material survival of the population they claim to serve.
They operate under the belief that their administrative frameworks are doing good, while their policy choices are atomizing the vulnerable.
The irony is inescapable. Policy advocates austerity as a shared sacrifice, but the sacrifice is only shared by those outside the elite administrative structure.
The lesson here, which the sources really highlight, is that institutional growth for the managerial class often functions as a substitute for actual social welfare.
It's the professionalization of poverty management, where the management class consumes resources that would otherwise go to poverty alleviation. The administrative cost of managing the poor often exceeds the actual resources provided to them. The managerial class is actively profiting from the ideological justification that cutting welfare is tough love.
And this systematic behavior is possible because of what's called policy capture, where elite preferences fundamentally drive policy implementation, regardless of broad public opinion or the consequential harm to the majority.
The data on policy influence is striking. Studies that track proposed legislation show that strong support for a policy among the middle class has a negligible impact on whether it passes. However, strong support among Americans in the top income decile, those earning at least $173,000 a year, doubles the probability that a policy will be adopted.
Which means the policymaking agenda is effectively set by the small group of people who are most insulated from the consequences of that agenda.
Yes, and that policy capture enables the real-world manifestation of luxury beliefs, and the consequences are often externalized onto the poor. The example of the defund the police movement is perhaps the clearest modern example of this phenomenon.
Right. During 2020 and 2021, nationwide surveys consistently found that the wealthiest Americans, and specifically highly educated, affluent white Democrats, were the strongest supporters of reducing police funding.
They were geographically and financially protected from the immediate fallout.
So what happened when many major U.S. cities subsequently reduced their police spending?
The consequences were immediately borne by the poorest communities. The ensuing surge in violent crime homicides, robberies, aggravated assaults disproportionately harmed the poor, who were the demographic least supportive of the movement in the first place.
The numbers are staggering.
They are. The poorest Americans are 7 times more likely to be victims of robbery and 20 times more likely to be victims of sexual assault than high-income Americans. People residing in areas with over 20% poverty are more than 100 times more likely to be murdered than those in affluent neighborhoods. This confirms the operating definition of a luxury belief. The affluent supported the belief, and the poor paid the price.
So if the administrative state is prioritizing its own growth, the ideological infrastructure supporting it must also be examined. This leads us to the role of academia and legacy media in maintaining this system.
They function, in the analysis, primarily as credentialing agencies and narrative managers for the managerial class. Their current role is to reinforce the ideological framework that justifies austerity for the working class and expansion for the bureaucratic class.
The silence from these institutions regarding the punitive nature of the OBBBA cuts and the underlying economic erosion is not accidental.
No, it signifies their functional capture by the very class whose interests they serve.
The ultimate irony of this ideological structure is laid bare in the modern college application process, which focuses so intensely on articulating hardship, the so-called adversity narrative.
This is a perfect example of a mechanism designed to identify merit being co-opted for class advantage. Elite universities seek these narratives, but the most well-off students are the ones who are most adept and fluent at mining and articulating perceived hardship. The smallest setback is framed as overcoming trauma to obscure their actual privilege.
They're coached, often by expensive consultants, to present their minor struggles in the specific, palatable narrative style that university gatekeepers are trained to recognize and reward.
Whereas those with genuine crushing hardship often struggle to articulate their trauma in that accepted format. Precisely. A student raised in genuine poverty who may have experienced profound trauma like familial substance abuse or housing insecurity often strives desperately for normalcy. They are reluctant to dwell on or articulate their vulnerability because they find it humiliating, or they simply lack the cultural capital and vocabulary to package their reality into a compelling, exploitable narrative.
They avoid perseverating on hardship, while their privileged peers are celebrated for expertly performing it.
Which ultimately reinforces the existing system, allowing the most advantaged to continue occupying elite institutions while simultaneously believing they earned their spot by overcoming manufactured adversity.
So we have established a self-perpetuating, interconnected system. The Cantillon effect ensures monetary policy concentrates wealth and erodes the common floor. Legislative action via the OBBBA Act systemically cleanses the social remainder to cut costs. And ideological mechanisms, these luxury beliefs, provide the moral justification while ensuring the managerial class thrives. It is a full-spectrum default.
It is, as the sources conclude, a systemic closure. The managerial state is in its terminal phase, strategically shedding the burdens of the social contract and consuming its own foundations to preserve its core administrative and financial structures. It is a clinical desertification of a Leviathan in the process of consuming its own foundations.
A sobering and powerful assessment of how economics, policy, and ideology have converged to produce this outcome.
In this approaching civilizational winter, the only viable refuge lies in individual cognitive sovereignty and relentless, small-scale, parallel collaboration, building anew outside the decaying edifice.